Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And for the last couple of years, I've been sharing with you how important the challenge of Christ truly is. And it seems to me that almost every day, I hear from someone that is issuing that challenge to Christianity, to me even. And what I mean by that is, as many of you are aware, and if you're not aware of it, pardon me, approximately a month ago, I had a formal 2.5-hour debate with a man by the name of Mark Smith. The debate was carried on a platform called Myth Vision. The host of that program is Derek Lambert, real nice young guy, but he is a former Christian turned atheist. Mark Smith is a former Christian turned atheist. And Mark Smith says, Jesus said, sorry about that, in the debate that I had, back in April, a month ago, my opponent, Mark Smith, former Christian turned atheist, said Jesus was coming back in the first century. He did not do it. He failed. The apostles said the coming of the Lord was at hand, coming soon, quickly, shortly, etc., etc. None of it happened. Therefore, they are all false teachers, liars. We ought to just throw the Bible away. Now, that was a 2.5-hour debate. What Mr. Smith was affirming was that Jesus failed his own challenge. And what's tragic to me, ladies and gentlemen, over and over and over again, I'm in discussions with individuals on the internet, believers, people who call themselves Christians. And when you point out what Jesus predicted and the temporal delimitation of when he said that was going to be fulfilled, and you ask them, okay, here's what Jesus said. Going to come back on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He said it was going to happen in that generation. Did he keep his word? You would not believe the number of believers, people who call themselves Christians, people who claim to love the Lord, people who claim to believe the Bible, and they tell me, no, he didn't do that. When I confront them with John 10:37, where Jesus, speaking to a hostile crowd, said, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Do not believe me for my words' sake, believe me for my works. They are very commonly, absolutely, totally stunned. Many of them just simply say, well, that doesn't mean what you're saying. And I respond by asking, well, okay, if that's not what it says, then Paul said, if Christ is not risen, we are found to be false witnesses, he and the apostles. Your faith is in vain. You are yet in your sin. So I asked these individuals, so Jesus said he was going to be raised from the dead. That's what he said he was going to do. And he said, don't believe me just because I say I'm going to do something. Don't believe me until and unless I do what I say I'm going to do. Now here's Paul saying, if he did not do what he said he was going to do, then he was a liar. Our faith is in vain. We're false witnesses. And he goes ahead to say, if in this life only we have hope, we're all men most miserable. Because you see, the resurrection of Jesus Christ gives us the assurance of life after death. I'd kind of like to get on my soapbox about this time, but I won't. Okay, this is incredibly important, incredibly thrilling and comforting. But nonetheless, okay, so what I've been trying to share with you over the last couple of years is how critically important it is that believers be fully equipped, fully informed, number one, about the challenge of Christ. It's there. It's undeniable. You know, I had somebody not long ago, this guy, for a good little while, basically stalked me on YouTube or Facebook, and essentially did nothing but mock me. And he said, the challenge of Christ was only for the people of the first century. It does not apply today. So when I asked him, well, okay, if it doesn't apply today, then what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 12 to 17 is not true today, right? Well, of course, he was entrapped, and he knew he was entrapped. He knew that if Christ did not raise himself from the dead, fulfilling his challenge, fulfilling his word, even his faith is in vain. So he kind of quit posting, and except I found out just the other day, he has continued to post in another forum, but he never tags me. Okay? He just goes off into his little tirades about what a false teacher and a heretic and antichrist that I am, but he never tags me anymore. Which, you know, to be honest about it, pretty fine with me. I'm okay with that because his illogic, his irrationality indicated to me that he was maybe a little bit imbalanced, didn't even seem to understand what a logical argument was, and he just got downright ugly. Okay, so all of that aside, I've been sharing with you how important it is to be equipped to answer the challenge of Christ. Folks, we cannot hide our head in the sand and think that the atheists are just going to accept what we say as believers and not challenge it. Do you think for one moment that the skeptics out there, the atheists, the agnostics out there are not aware of what Jesus predicted about his coming in the first century? Let me tell you, they are becoming increasingly militant, increasingly active in their challenges against Christ. Just like this Mark Smith that I debated. Wrote a book about that thick, Broken Promises. And I can tell you this, on that Myth Vision Facebook page, YouTube channel, literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people have expressed agreement with Mr. Mark Smith. You think it's not important that we be equipped? We need to take seriously Peter's words in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. Sanctify, which means set apart, okay? Sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart. Exalt him to the very top position as your Lord. That word Lord, folks, it doesn't mean boss, just that. It means God. Because you see, Lord is the Greek word that is used in the Septuagint to speak of Yahweh, the Father. That doesn't mean Jesus is the Father. It means that he acts with equality with the Father. So, here is Peter saying, sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart, and be ready always to give an answer. Well, the Greek word that is translated as answer there is apologia. It's the word from which we get our word, English word, apology. And no, it doesn't mean, oh, gee, I'm really sorry that I believe this. I'm really sorry if this offends you. No. Apologia in the Greek meant to give an orderly, logical, evidentiary reason for our hope. So let me ask you, as I've been sharing with you over these last 2 years, Are you capable of giving a reasoned, logical, evidentiary reason for believing in Jesus Christ and for believing that he did not fail? He did not lie, but that he kept his word. Can you do that? That's why I'm here, trying to give us all the evidence, the, shall we say, the ammunition that we need to answer the skeptics. This is critically important. So what I've been doing over the last several months is sharing with you the idea of the kairos. That's the Greek word, which means the divinely appointed time. I've shared with you how the Old Testament prophets set the time for the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 9, Daniel 12. We've been focused on Daniel 9 specifically. I'm not going to go back over all of the territory we've covered. I'm already at, almost 12 minutes here into my lesson. We have been examining the statement that 70 weeks were determined to finish the transgression. Now look, folks, this is so important. What Daniel was told, as I've shared with you, God cut out that 490-year period of time, designated it, appointed it for the fulfillment of all 6 constituent elements of Daniel 9:24 and following. Now, it's amazing to me. I understand it in a way. But people say, well, the 70 weeks were fulfilled at the cross. Well, now, did Jesus begin the fulfillment of Daniel 9:24 at the cross? Well, yes, he appeared at the end of the age to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. There's a reference to the cross. That doesn't mean that sin had been fully put away at the cross. You see, the writer is very careful to say that Christ appeared to put away sin by means of. The agency by which sin would be put away was his death. It doesn't mean that his death would be the point at which sin would be removed. Romans 11 is real clear on this. Sin would be taken away at the coming of the Lord out of Zion, which is not the cross. And others say, well, the 70 weeks was fulfilled at the stoning of Stephen. Well, once again, that's untenable, because 70 weeks were determined to fill up the measure of sin. Do you remember last week I shared with you that God has 4 cups? Cup of sin, cup of suffering, cup of wrath. Oh, and that 4th cup is the cup of blessing. The cup of sin is the sin of the enemies of God, very often Israel herself. And God was measuring those sins, putting those sins in his proverbial metaphoric cup. No, it's not a literal physical cup, obviously. But God was cognizant of the sins of his enemies, the disobedience of Israel so very, very commonly. When that cup of sin was full, and by the way, that cup of sin very often included the persecution of the saints, as we have been seeing, Matthew chapter 21, Matthew chapter 22. But when that cup of sin was full, that likewise meant that the cup of suffering on the part of God's saints was likewise full. So when the cup of sin was full, the cup of suffering was full, guess what? God's 3rd cup, the cup of wrath, was to be poured out on the ungodly, on the persecutors of God's people. So we've been examining in depth several New Testament passages that speak of the filling up of the measure of sin. Now, very, very quickly, let's set the temporal context again, okay? 70 weeks are determined from the going forth of the decree to rebuild and to restore Jerusalem until the coming of the Messiah. There's a time frame. There's a time cut out by God from here to here. Jesus appeared at just the right time. Romans chapter 5, 6 and following. For when we were yet without strength, in due time, which means at just the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Galatians chapter 4, verse 5, in the fullness of the time, in the fullness of the kairos, meaning that divinely appointed time that Daniel had spoken of in Daniel 2, that he had foretold in Daniel chapter 7, that he was foretelling in Daniel 9, that he would foretell in Daniel chapter 12. The fullness of that time had arrived in the first century. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, there's simply no way out of this. And let me give this little bitty diversion, okay? It's extremely common these days. It is becoming more and more common in the postmillennial world. It's even common in the historic premillennial world to say, well, no, there's no question whatsoever that there was a typological fulfillment, for instance, of Daniel, chapter 2, 7, 9, even in Daniel chapter 12, a typological fulfillment. Oh, but the events of AD 70, which fulfilled those prophecies, the events of AD 70, those things, or AD 70, was a type and a shadow of the real end, which occurs at the end of time. So they have Daniel 2, 7, 9, and 12 fulfilled in AD 70. But that fulfillment foreshadowed another ultimate fulfillment. Oh, and one individual says, well, you know, for instance, in the book of Revelation, you got the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord. Revelation 6, Revelation 12, Revelation 16, Revelation 19, Revelation chapter 20. And this individual with whom I've been corresponding says, all of these days of the Lord, Revelation 6, Revelation 12, 16, these are all preliminary days of the Lord, pointing forward, typifying the ultimate end of time day of the Lord. No, they're not. I mean, this is argumentum ad desperatum, magnified 10 times. There is not one scintilla of evidence, not a type, not a jot, not a tittle, in the book of Revelation that says, okay, this day of the Lord points to this day of the Lord. Oh, and this day of the Lord was fulfilled, but it points to this other day of the Lord that hasn't been fulfilled yet. You need to get a copy of my book, AD 70, A Shadow of the, quote, or parentheses, real, parentheses, end, question mark. In that book, I adduce 15 reasons, ladies and gentlemen, 15 reasons why AD 70 was not a type or a shadow of anything else. It was the fulfillment. Do you realize not one single New Testament writer ever says we are types of something else? Do you realize there's not one New Testament writer that ever says, now what's about to happen foreshadows what will ultimately happen? Not one. Not a hint, not a shadow, not a clue, not a suggestion of such a thing being true. So I've got to move on here. We've looked at Matthew 21, we've looked at Matthew 22 in regard to the filling up of the measure of sin. I want to come down to Matthew chapter 23, as I suggested to you last week. Jesus was standing in the temple. This is during the last week of his life. He is about to be betrayed, crucified, buried, but risen again. Glory be. But as he stands in the temple, and remember, Jesus is purposely purposely at this point trying to provoke the Jews to crucify him. Why? Because he said the Son of Man came not to be ministered to, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. Jesus came to offer himself a sacrifice. And that meant that he had to provoke the Jews, the Pharisees particularly. Standing in the temple then, Jesus issued a long list of woes. Some count 7 woes, others count 6. I'm not concerned about the specific number. But for time consideration, we got to come down to verse 29. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Can you imagine modern preachers standing up and pointing the finger like that? That would be what you call a moving sermon. He would be moving very shortly after that. Anyway, because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Therefore, you are witnesses against yourselves that you are the sons of those who killed the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Do you remember? We looked at Isaiah chapter 65, verse 6. In that prediction of the last days, in that prediction of the first century, and we know it was a prophecy of the first century generation because Paul applied it to that in Romans 10:22 and following. So in Isaiah 65:6, the Lord says, your sins and the sins of your fathers will I measure into your bosom. Well, isn't that exactly and precisely what is being said here by Jesus in Matthew chapter 23? Fill up the measure of your father's guilt. Isaiah 65, you're going to fill up the measure of your sin. You're going to take the sin of your fathers, add it to your guilt, fill up the measure. Matthew 23, your father's sin, you're going to add to it by doing the same thing that they did. They killed the prophets. Behold, Jesus said, you serpents, you brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of Gehenna? Therefore, indeed, I send unto you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Now, Luke chapter 11 adds to that and says, I send to you apostles and prophets, wise men, and scribes. You see, Jesus wasn't excluding the apostles here by any stretch of the imagination. Point of fact is, he said, I'm going to send my servants to you. Some of them you shall scourge, some you'll crucify, some you'll chase from city to city. Now watch. That upon you may come all of the righteous blood of all of the righteous shed upon the earth, from righteous Abel unto Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. Assuredly, from the Greek term, amin, lego, humin, meaning without any doubt whatsoever, no way, no how will this fail. All of these things will come upon this generation. Could words be any clearer, ladies and gentlemen? You know, I've had people say to me, well, you know, Preston, you're obviously wrong because the Bible teaches that Christ would come to judge the world. And the fall of Jerusalem was nothing but a localized judgment that nobody in the world cared about. In 2008, I had a 2-day formal debate with a Church of Christ minister by the name of John Welch. And he got up and very pompously and arrogantly says, Preston says AD 70 was the judgment of the world. He said, folks, that was a strictly localized judgment. It happened in Judea. And he said, what did the folks in Corinth, 800 miles away? What did the folks in Thessalonica, 1,000 miles away? They didn't care about the destruction of Jerusalem. It meant absolutely nothing to them. And for the 2 days of that debate, I've got to tell you, for the 2 days of that debate, I had double pneumonia. Every single night after the debate, I would go back to the room and throw up. Sorry. Don't mean to be offensive, but that's what I did every single night. When I got back, I was put in the hospital with the double pneumonia. What's that Rush Limbaugh used to say? That in debating liberals, he could beat them with half his brain tied behind his back. Well, guess what? I had about 3/4 of my brain tied behind my back. But when John Welch made the comment that nobody in Corinth, nobody in Thessalonica, nobody in Athens would care anything whatsoever about the fall of Jerusalem, and it would mean absolutely nothing to them, I got up and I said, well, Brother Welch tells us that the fall of Jerusalem meant nothing because it was so far away. It was 1,000 miles away. And I said, well, let me ask you folks, how far away was the crucifixion from Corinth, or Thessalonica, or Athens, or America? And I turned to him, I said, Brother Welch, is the crucifixion of Christ meaningless to us since it's so far away, according to your argument? Did it have no meaning to those in Corinth, or Athens, or Thessalonica, according to your argument? It was so far away, who cared about it? And I said, let me assure you, ladies and gentlemen, more people knew and more people were impacted by the fall of Jerusalem on a purely physical level than the crucifixion of Christ. So I guess it was unimportant, and I guess nobody should care about it. You know that's false. I know that's false. And I'm out of time. I'll pick up on Matthew 23 next week.